When filmmaker Ilie Mitaru first came across Service Salih's Instagram feed, he was immediately struck by the power of the images. Photographs made by children from displaced and marginalized communities across Turkey. These weren't typical snapshots. They were visceral, energetic, and deeply intimate. Images that revealed not only a sharp visual instinct, but also a sense of confidence and presence that belied the children's limited experience of photography. Ilie knew it was a story he had to tell. The story became First Frames, a film that doesn't center on hardship or trauma, but instead honors the perspective of the children behind the lens. Ilie was not interested in portraying them as passive subjects of their circumstances. He wanted to embrace the weird, quirky, magical nature of their thinking and show them as playful, resilient, and complex individuals. First Frames invites us into their world, allowing us to witness their friendships, curiosities, frustrations, and imaginations through their eyes and in their own voices. This is Ibarionex, and this is The Candid Frame. Ilie, welcome to The Candid Frame. I'm really excited to have you and talk to you about your wonderful film.
Thank you for having me.
Just looking through your CV, you've accomplished a lot as a filmmaker. Before we get into the story of First Frames, talk to me about your journey as a filmmaker, particularly that of a storyteller.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. You so often hear the narrative of young filmmakers or photographers. Their dad gave them a camera when they're 10 or 11 years old, and they took to it and they ran with it for the next 20 or 30 years of their career. And I think I really admire that narrative and wish I had that. I think for myself, finding documentary cinema and photography has been a decades-long process of searching for what medium would suit me, for where I felt I could have a voice and an impact, and and a community as well, a creative community that would help support that. So, I've had many jobs in my 20s. I kind of dabbled and tried many things. I was a teacher. I did a tech startup, and then I started freelance writing, and that suited me okay. And I worked for a little while at a magazine in Oregon called Oregon Business Magazine, and sort of during that period realized that I was kind of making it up as I went along, and applied to the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, where I figured I would continue to write and do long form kind of work. And that was the time, 2011, 2012, when a lot of photographers originally were realizing that 5D Mark I could shoot just incredible cinema. Mm-hmm. I think that there was a minute or two of a window you could continue to roll in at the time. And so I signed up not knowing that it would sort of change the course of my career to a video journalism course. And I remember that first course, it was interesting because I felt like with writing, it was always an uphill battle for me. And it was something that I was very proud of when I, got a commission and published a story, and I loved the chase of the reporting, but the writing itself was always an uphill battle. And when I got a camera in my hand, there was something so instinctual to it that it just started to make sense. And I thought, God, why am I, if I can tell stories that are powerful in any of these mediums, why not choose the one that sort of fits your affinity better? And I also began originally as a filmmaker. I mean, at first it was in TV news, a lot of web, short, quick hit web kind of work. And I slowly began to want to tell deeper stories, want more time with those. And so slowly built larger and larger projects and deeper projects where I would spend more time with the subjects. And it was only recently that I sort of incorporated photography in the last 4 or 5 years into my practice as a way to stay out in the field, be more versatile. But it really has been, a long journey of sampling and trying things to figure out where I can, where I feel at home in that medium.
I completely understand that statement about the uphill battle as a writer. I mean, I've been making my living as a writer as much as I have a photographer. And I got to tell you, that first sentence is always a pain in the ass. You know, I give myself more grief and I struggle more with, getting that first sentence up, on the page, or in this case, on the screen. But, filmmaking is no less challenging. Because there's, when you're writing, it's just you and the keyboard. When you're making a film, there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle. Talk to me about, that part of it, because yes, writing it can be a real pain in the ass, especially getting started. But when you're working on a film, we're talking about a much longer time frame than what it would take me to spit out 2,500 words.
You are, I think that it's I like that chaos, to be really honest with you. There's nothing I like more than being in the field. I'll often, as a freelancer, have these long stretches of time where I'm not working and I start to reconsider my entire career trajectory. Mm-hmm. And I think I need a vacation, then I think I need to shift gears, and then a job will hit and I'll be reminded, it will like just knock the dust of out of my whole system, and I'll kind of be reminded why I love this work and why I love being out there. And so I think that my disposition just lends itself to really enjoying when the stakes are very high, when you really got to sort of capture that moment. And when it's clicking, I mean, of course, we've all had days out in the field as a photographer or writer or whatever, where it's not clicking. But when it is, there's kind of nothing like it. And I think I've been doing this long enough that I kind of understand the peaks and valleys that any shoot will have. And sometimes, the hard part can be in the beginning, and sometimes it can be in the end, and sometimes it can be in post. But there's always sort of a metabolism to all the jobs. And I think being experienced and old enough to know that I've done, hundreds of kinds of jobs, that to say, okay, well, this is how this one is going to go. I wonder when it's going to open up. And I've been on so many shoots where, let's say it's a 10-day shoot and you're on day 8 and you go, God, I don't think we have anything. And it opens up in those last 2 days, and 80% of the film or the series or whatever, I do a lot of kind of sponsored content type documentaries. A lot of, all that stuff is from the last day or two. So I think that that process I really, really love. It feels like I do everything else in order to get myself out in the field. And that's kind of been my discipline. I've just been okay with, I used to ask myself, well, if I don't like, if the other stuff is difficult, should I sort of stay in the game? But I think at the end of the day, that's filmmaking, that's the creative process. And then you spoke to something else that I think is really critical, and I think also has actually led me both deeper into filmmaking, but also has really built some resiliency, which is the community. I mean, both the community in New York that I have here of, friends and filmmakers that will look at stuff and sort of support you and throw you a job here or there. But the folks that you sort of bring into a given project, to me, that's been kind of the most motivating and the most humbling, because I find myself with a caliber of a team that I can't believe want to work on my stuff. Mm-hmm. And that to me is sort of the most motivating thing. And it's amazing when you're out there with a small crew. Most of the crews that I work with are, 3 to 6 or 7 people out in the field. And when you have that collaboration, everybody's trying to push one another to make something better. And it's not about ego, and it's not about, did you do my idea or my idea? It's about in the moment, as, the action, as it were, in a documentary is unfolding in front of you. You have to think very, very fast to try to kind of elevate. Well, what if we shot it through this reflection? Well, did you remember to ask him that? All these little tiny things. To me, I'm the director on this film and a bunch of others, but it's that collaboration that I really love, because it really makes me so much better than I would ever be as a one-man band, as a photographer or as a writer, when you're often kind of soloing it. So I feel like I have a huge amount of support out in the field when I do work in these kinds of teams.
Was there a particular filmmaker or film that you saw early on that really sort of crystallized for you what you wanted to do as a filmmaker?
I'm always so bad at throwing references out, because I feel like there's a whole slew of documentaries that do a fantastic job of capturing what everyday people go through. People that you would walk across the street and you wouldn't think twice about. Mm-hmm. And the complexity, the brilliance, the resilience of those folks. And I think, to me, when I see films like that, like, it really shakes me to my core and kind of cracks me open, often for a couple days, to be a better human being and a better citizen, because it makes you see those people that you're sharing the subway with or that you're waiting in line for your coffee with a little bit differently. And I think it gives them the grace that all of us should have for one another. And so I think, yes, we want them to be cinematic and entertaining and all of these things that we want out of our documentary filmmaking these days. But at its core, I think I'm interested in what is that human experience from a person that you might not look twice at, that is not a politician or is not somebody that we normally would shed light on. And there's a long and deep documentary verite practice of doing that kind of work. And I still feel, in a sense, I'm sort of just getting started in that, but that has been more than sort of a cause from an activist perspective or a theme or an area of focus. I think those are kinds of my guiding forces, is finding people that are open in that way and that are open to sharing their stories. And most folks, if you really continue to peel those layers back, do have a story like that. I'm sure that if we would just chat for a couple hours, you would have a very similar story, and a story that would inspire a lot of folks if told correctly. So I like that challenge. The other thing I would say, sort of pivoting off of your question, is I tend to also like when there is something that can be cinematic about it. I try my best to stay away from sort of the talking head kinds of interviews, and I'm always looking at what is the action that will happen that will tell the story by watching that action happen? And can we get there with cameras in time, which is the hard part, right? So those are sort of the elements. It's not so much the theme or the goal of making a certain sort of political point is what is being said, and can we, or what is the thing that's happening, and can we get there in a way in order to capture it? And with First Frames, it sort of checked all those boxes. And then the other thing it did was that these young kids, mostly in photo, but also in video, were also shooting their own stuff. And so it was this amazing opportunity to leverage all the amazing kind of footage that they took and really kind of let you inside their lives in a way that would have been very difficult for, an outside team to do in a realistic amount of time.
How did you find out about Servist, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly?
Servist, yeah.
Servist. How did you find out about him and the work that he was doing?
I wish I had a more a surprising story. I came across his work on Instagram, and being sort of a newish photographer, I was really blown away by his Instagram. Has all of the pictures that the children have taken, And there was something so kind of unexpected, unorthodox, untraditional in how these kids take pictures. Yeah. It was that kind of like energy that maybe because, you sort of get taught out of you often because you want it to be in focus and perfect and the frame to be here. Yeah. And I just had one of those moments. I think we've all done this with art that we find on our phones when you're hunched over and then you realize half an hour has gone by and you're like, whoa. And so we had a mutual friend who had sent me that link, and she had known Servist. She had donated to his program and connected us. And a week later, we got on a call. And he's such a lovely human being. I think one of the things I look for now, having made this mistake many times in my career early, is the person that you're going to be working with it needs to be a collaborator, and that needs to be something you're comfortable with, often for years, if not at least months. And so what I really try to feel out early on in a process of kind of vetting or pre-production about whether or not I'm going to work on a story is, do I get along with this person? Does this person want to talk to me? I'm very clear about the time needed, in a sense, what that production will be like. We only shot for about 2 weeks, but there was a lot of pre-production, and then he really sort of stayed on and, helped share more of the students' photos. And then our producer went back to shoot more. So it was very involved throughout the process. And I just adored the guy. We got along super well. And the conversation kind of kept going. And then we had amazing backers from the team at We Present, which is the arts platform of the tech company We Transfer, which has for a decade or so given funds to photojournalists, documentary filmmakers, dancers, artists, and they do such an incredible job because it's quite hands off, and they love the project, and they said, we love your vision, go and do what you want to do with it. And so, all these projects take longer than you would think, but that started a 1.5-year project of putting this thing together and filming, and then, a very long post-production process. But it was one of those things that I have to say, it was tough at first, and then something sort of clicked, and all these amazing team members came through, and money came through, and things just started to happen in a really lovely way. So I felt less like I was driving it, and more like I was hanging on for this thing that had some momentum of its own, So it's been a really, really fulfilling 1.5 years of making something that I'm super proud of.
Yeah, and the film revolves primarily around the kids. But in doing my research, I learned that Service themselves was a refugee at one point from Syria, and that somehow photography for him became sort of a life preserver in a way, which he sort of passed on to the kids that he teaches. Tell us more about him and how this work he does came about.
The organization that Cerbes runs the workshop through, or I should say used to run, he's went and started his own mobile darkroom project, and I hope I can send you those links and things when we run the show, because it'd be nice to link him through to his new organization. You're right in saying that I think that he said he had some, I'm trying to remember exactly, but some kind of office administrative kind of job, and always loved photography. I think that he had studied it. And when he came to Turkey, had begun photographing again, and had spoken very powerfully about how it helped him sort of re-find his voice and find his footing in his new home. What I really loved was that the way that he teaches photography was, I think, connected to sort of how he taught himself or found his footing in the craft. It's very, very open. He gives these kids his cameras. He teaches them some basics, but he doesn't tell them what to photograph or how to photograph it. He really encourages experimentation. He tries to get at a kind of childlike curiosity that a lot of these kids have, and doesn't try to sort of beat them over the head with the right and wrong way to do it. And so all of his workshops are quite free. I mean, we have a couple shots or little moments where he's giving you some instructions, but most of the workshop started with some very, 10, 15 minutes. This is how you hold the camera. These are how you can do, different angles. And if you shoot somebody from down low looking up, it makes them look big. If you shoot somebody from up high looking down, it makes them look small or maybe less powerful. But then let the kids sort of figure out what that photo practice meant to them. And for us as filmmakers, sort of the fly on the wall, that was really perfect, because we were less interested in kind of how these kids learn photography. And what I wanted to get from this film was, what is it like when somebody who hasn't had exposure to a certain art form or a craft anywhere in the world, what is it like when that person is introduced to that, and they have to sort of grapple with what that does to their surroundings, to their world, how they want to engage with, in the case of the children that we filmed with, how do they engage in circumstances that are quite difficult? And I wanted to bring no preconceptions, just like Cerbes brought very little preconceptions about giving the cameras out, which is why the film has, I would say, maybe some surprising narratives from the children.
Oh,
you know, it wasn't
God,
all
yeah.
doom and gloom. I mean, most of them were quite inspired. I mean, there's some heartbreaking sort of insights from some of the kids, but that was really lovely for us to sort of, it's like we were the extension of Sir Best's workshops. You know, he would give these cameras and then he would sort of start the conversation. And then we were, without really much finagling, kind of allowed to witness as they engaged in this medium, you know, and each of them kind of had their own perspective based on, you know, who they were and the circumstances that they found themselves in.
And there was as much wisdom coming from the kids as they were from Sir Best.
You know, I wanted to very much, I have a bunch of nieces and nephews, and for a long time, I kind of recognized that they have this way of speaking in this sort of magical, nonsensical way of making sense of their world. Mm-hmm. And it was always so disarming to me. You know, it was like, there's this quote, I'm spacing on who it's from, talking about how poetry is language for which you have no defenses. And I felt like the dialogue of these children, the dialogue of all children, in a sense, is language for which you have no defenses. You can't really quickly put it in a certain part of your head and kind of, you know, put it in that box. And so when this project came up, you know, you talked about what do you look for in a film. One of the things I was really excited about was the opportunity to kind of get you in those kids' world, kind of as fast as possible, not to spend a lot of time on Sir Best, not to spend a lot of time on, oh, here's the geopolitical situation, or here's the different locations that were impacted by the earthquake and why they were impacted in this way, which are important stories to be told for sure. But for me, it was that critical time where you're like hanging out with a kid who trusts you, who's experiencing something new. And the fact that it was art and photography, I mean, it sort of checked all of these boxes. But I think for me, that's what I really, really was passionate about getting to. And it was always that, how can we cut the, you know, it's kind of like a Jenga game when you're doing the edit and you think you need all this stuff in order to explain. Now you're here and these kids are doing this. And then you can slowly pull out those Jenga blocks and kind of get to the core without as much exposition as you think you would need. And so there was a version, you know, the film is 26 minutes long. There was a 48-minute version was the first cut. And we were just slowly like, well, what is this film about? What makes sense here? What are we trying to say? And for me, that was one of the things that I never really wavered in, which is that I just want to bring you in these kids' world when they're experiencing these cameras and feel what that's like.
The instruction that he gave those kids was just wonderful. When he talks about asking them about how they're feeling, right? Mm-hmm. Talking about what they're seeing and what they're photographing, but tying it into what they're feeling. Man, I'm trying to teach my adults the very same thing, you know, because they get that sort of beat out of them and they just think in terms of rules, right? And he emphasizes this is not about rules. This is not about adhering to some sort of, you know, rigid structure of what a photograph is. It's about how you feel. And then using the camera to express that. And I felt that was marvelous to hear. It was wonderful to be reminded. But it was remarkable to see that manifest in the photographs of kids who don't have the expensive equipment that most of these listeners, you know, possess themselves. Yeah. And under, you know, much more difficult circumstances than most people will ever experience. Yet, you know, the images have a poignancy, an intimacy to them that's just really remarkable.
Yeah. I felt I'm so glad that resonated with you, because that as well was, to me, sort of the key of this film. A lot of what he had done, depending on the community he had went to. So there was 3 communities, and the first 3 that are left in the edit, we had to leave some on the chopping room floor. But the first one is not a community that was heavily hit by the earthquake zone. The second 2, by the earthquakes rather. The second 2 are, and part of those he has a feeling card game, just to explain to listeners or watchers, whereby they're quite complex emotions for young children. And he puts them down and he unpacks them so that they have language to maybe put to what they're feeling. And so one of the young boys said that he was feeling anxious. And in a dialogue with him, it came out that he was feeling anxious because he was scared that another earthquake would happen. And this was in a village that had very little government response. I mean, we were there 2 months or so after the earthquake, and folks were still living in camping tents in front of their broken down homes, and they would go into the rubble if they needed a frying pan or something that they had forgotten, so the aid had not really reached this place. And he was very scared that another earthquake could happen. It's creating for them, I think, a language that for sure is connected to photography and for processing through photography. But I think especially after the earthquake, which sort of changed the communities, obviously, that he reached out to, it was also, let's give these kids a chance to process and to just be kids and to maybe connect with an emotionality that they're not given opportunity for. I mean, a lot of these children weren't going to school when they were in these camps because school systems weren't set up at the time. So, when we arrived at these camps, it was quite moving, both for the parents, and I found it quite moving because that was the only kind of education, group arts kinds of things that were happening in some of these communities. And so, it had a weight that I think if you weren't there, it was hard to sort of really grasp.
AltadenaPhotographers.org is a hometown effort to support photographers impacted by the recent fires, many of whom lost not only their archives, but the very tools they use to make a living. This nonprofit was created by photographers for photographers, and through this registry, those in need can share what they've lost, and donors, whether individuals or companies, can help replace essential gear. Both monetary and equipment donations are welcomed and deeply appreciated. To find out how you can help, visit AltadenaPhotographers.org. One of the kids makes a remarkable observation about the way adults versus kids sort of process and see things. And
will you remind me?
I wish I had written it down. I think it was one of the girls about halfway through the film, and she's talking about how the difference between adults and kids. And I wish I remembered exactly what she did it, but it was an observation that I felt, man, that is so clear and so concise that could only have come from a kid, right? Yeah. That it wasn't overly sort of processed, that it was that there was a sort of a genuineness in her observation that wasn't colored about, is it the right thing to say?
Yeah.
And I think that finds its way into the photographs because, you could look at those photographs and technically speaking, you could see things that you're supposed to do and not do, right? But there's something that elevates the images beyond that really speaks to the ability to go to that sort of genuine, true place within themselves and be able to express it either in words or through photographs.
Yeah, I think that we caught these kids at the right age where they have the intuition, the creativity, the insight, but they don't yet have that maybe self-consciousness that sets in your early teenage years. And so that was really lovely that they didn't see anything cliche about taking a picture of a flower or their best friend because they love their best friend. Yeah. And I think that there is that lack of cynicism is so nice. I have to say it's so refreshing. It's refreshing like when you see it, and then it's refreshing when you see the images because there is so much cynicism in the world that like it's nice to have a break and to sort of put yourself in to hear these children that are so excited about the things that might cause, if somebody our age would say it, to roll their eyes. If you go to a photo workshop and you want to take a picture of a flower.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think that joy and that excitement and that, optimism, even in some of those difficult circumstances, was both really surprising and kind of infectious, and something we really, really fought to preserve in the edit. There is this moment, I'm not sure if you remember it, but when Zumra, one of the young children in the earthquake zone, in one of the earthquake camps, at the end of the workshop, Cerbes says they're doing some Q&A and kind of chatting, and she goes on one of her little rants, and she talks about how her life got better since the earthquake. And then she goes to say how, because when she was before the earthquake, she was living next to a really busy street, and her mom wouldn't let her play outside because a car could hit her. And now that she's in the earthquake camp, she can run around with these kids in this tent encampment. And we really went back and forth with, do we leave this thing in the film? Because it kind of maybe goes against what you would assume. We don't want to put forward that everybody, that anybody is sort of happier because of this earthquake, God forbid. But to us, it really cut to the core of how children have a different perspective and have the ability to say things that are so true to their experience, even if they might be unexpected or go against the narrative that you're coming in with. And so we really tried to kind of have those moments and find a way to stitch them together that felt like you're just hanging out with them for a while. And what they say is beautiful because it's just a kid saying it. And it's not part of a broader thesis. It's part of the experience of being with young people, which to me has always been something quite inspiring.
Well, I really related to her because we lost our home in January to the Eaton fire. Right.
Oh, God.
So, when I heard her say that, and she had lost everything herself, I know what that experience feels like when, in the midst of that devastation, wonderful things happen. Right? It's not all dark. It's not all sad. It's not all grief. And you couldn't anticipate it before it happens. But out of that, would I prefer to have kept my home? Absolutely. Right? But there are some things that have happened subsequently that are priceless to me. And when she said that, I completely got it. So I'm really glad that you had it in there because I think that is, an important perspective to have, especially having a child say that. Because as we said before, an adult saying that would probably qualify it in a very sort of different way.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. And you had said something else or noted something else that I think was interesting when we started to look at the rough cut, which is that these children, even in the experience of filming them, not that we sort of manufactured this, but they have this ability to go from the very, very sad to the very, very light, and to hold sort of both of those things in almost the same in the same kind of scene or experience, or when they're speaking about something. Mm-hmm. They don't sort of this Buddhist detachment of not hanging on to things, so they might be really upset one moment and then see a flower or see how, I remember this didn't make it in the edit, but one of the children were telling us something quite sad about what they had lost in the earthquake. And he's telling us this, and I see his eyes go up, up, up. And he goes, "Man, that cloud is beautiful. Look at that." And it was this sort of, that's how kids are, that they are able to perceive the world around them so immediately, and are able to very often, have a cry if something is sad, and then allow the beautiful thing to take them out of that. And I found that quite moving as well, because we all, as adults, and I am very sorry for the loss of your home, but, we all deal with loss and disappointment. And I think that for me, this was a huge reminder in the ways to live, right? And both, I talked at the outset of this call for the hope that the impact I hope my films will have at some point, and maybe at the end of my career. But for me, it really is even just making these films and being in these communities. It's you learn so much. It's a practice of becoming better at being a human being and seeing how one can, regardless of their circumstances, focus on the positive and find light in chaos in many instances. And so it was really a balm for me, and for what I was going through at the time in my life. I went down there, and it completely changed me. That experience.
How so?
Well, I don't want to get too much into it, but I just have been dealing with personal stuff, and the pandemic also had kind of taken a bite out of my regular work. And I was at this place where I thought, well, gosh, let me try to make one more film, and let's see how it feels. Let's see if it still feels like this is what I should be doing with my life. And the way that thing came about, that this project came about, and being in the field and listening to these kids, the team that came forward, it was sort of a resounding yes, that this is what I'm meant to be doing in this world. So it was a balm in so many ways for me, this film. And even, getting to meet you, and sort of this whole process now of talking about the film has been really, really lovely. I'm glad that it resonates with folks.
When it becomes being a filmmaker, you start off with an idea of what you think the story is. When you're doing all the prep work leading up to the shoot, you sort of have formulated an idea of what the framework is. Then you start to shoot, and you're still looking for the story. And then when it comes down to sitting down there in front of the computer to edit it, again, you're looking for sort of the story, right? Mm-hmm. And you talk about going from that initial 45 minutes down to the 23 minutes or so. It's the entire film. Talk to me about that sort of journey in terms of finding the story within the story until you finally settle on, the end result.
So I have to first give a big shout out to our editor, because I didn't cut this film. Our editor is Yalda Mostajaran, who I've met years ago doing different contract work, and I sort of floated it by her and I said, hey, do you want to maybe look at this? And she had seen some screen grabs, and we had a long conversation, and she was like, I'm in. And so shipped her the drives, and it was one of those funny decisions that I didn't think twice about it. And it was such a tricky edit, both because there's a lot of characters for a 25, 26-minute piece. And then also thematically, as we said, it's a lot of characters saying a lot of different kinds of things. I mean, we didn't really have a North Star in the way that you would often have everybody sort of supporting the same thesis or theme. We're kind of all over the place in a way. And so I think her experience allowed us to sort of hold it together and not make it feel cohesive. You're very much correct, I think, in noting the process where it is pre-production. We think it's this thing. And we do production Bibles and style sheets and pre-scripts and story beats and all the tools that documentary filmmakers have to maybe try to prepare as much as they can before they get out in the field. And then invariably you get in the field and it's like, oh, fuck, this is quite different, and you're always surprised with the things you were communicated or lost in translation as to what was happening. The challenges are never the ones you think that are going to be there. And then we start all over. The first couple days was really chaotic. One of the really just practical things was that the photo workshops, Cerbest would give out the cameras, and he goes, go take photos. And the kids would just with their energy. And we would be like, oh, God, who do we chase and how do we keep up with this thing? And so, we had a chat with Cerbest. We said, hey, do you think maybe you can sort of keep the kids in a group through some of this? And he goes, yeah, no problem. So some of this really practical. Other stuff is it's a little bit more of like you're feeling it out. In this film, as I imagine most, but in this, because they're children, it really was critical that we had characters that, both the kids and the parents' kids were really okay with us filming. And the kids, a child might not say, I don't want to be on camera, but their body language might not really they will react to the camera, being as close as this microphone is to me, in a certain way. Maybe they get more formal, maybe a little more stiff. They answer the questions a little bit more curtly. All of the kids that ended up in the film, we would have cameras on them for hours, and they just didn't care. They were excited about it. They were happy to play around, with taking pictures. Some of them just had this kind of, Zoomer was sort of like this. She had a very kind of external way of processing. And so she would have her camera and she would just be talking to herself, which as a filmmaker is really a great tool, because you have a mic on her, or she's boomed, and you just get all this great stuff, as opposed to having to prompt her. The other thing, I think, just from a craft perspective, I'm kind of going off the rails from your question, but that we did that was interesting and I think worked quite well was Zeynep Bilginsoy, who was our producer in Turkey, who speaks Turkish. We didn't ask sort of traditional questions in the sense that I would ask Zeynep and Zeynep would translate, and then that answer would be given back to Zeynep and then up the food chain, and I would say, oh, interesting, how about this? And we go down that way. Instead, me and Zeynep sort of put our heads together for a couple hours when I arrived in Turkey. And I said, these are the kinds of things we're trying to get to. And we just came up with broad prompts. I was filming along with Luke Bowitz, who was the other cinematographer on the project, because we wanted a lot of cover, because there's a lot of things to sort of keep cameras on. And so Zeynep did this amazing job where, especially when you're dealing with kids, it's half of it's energy, and does the child feel like you're really attentive and excited to sort of hang out with them, but would basically prompt them with very, very loose prompts. What are you up to? Do you like this? Why did you take that picture? And that's what I think gave us the really great kind of material that, we've both been speaking about, which are these kinds of insights, rants, funny sort of takes, as opposed to really asking formal questions, which I felt like for a child would just kind of shut them down. And so that was, coming out of the field work, I knew like I had many of those moments, because at the end of the day, we would kind of debrief, and, the earthquake moment, these different insights, I was sort of told too crudely. And then it was a question of just trying to figure out how to, in post, sort of the third piece of that, right? Pre-production, production, and post. How do you kind of make that hang together? And I have to say that this was probably one of the harder post-production processes I've been involved in, because of the nature of the material. The original film had a whole other group of kids, so it was 4 locations as opposed to 3. And we were just trying to jam a lot in there, because you fall in love with these kids, and all their little jokes and insights are amazing, and you want to keep them. And so it was a long process sort of carving that away. And as I said, carving away a lot of the exposition. And I must say that, Serbest had a much larger role initially. And I was like, you know what? I think this film is about the kids. And he was so gracious, because I said, do you mind? We're going to cut. He goes, no, it's about the kids. Let the kids have their voice. And so I'm not sure if I answered your question in a kind of concrete way, but, each time it obviously shifts. And sometimes you show up and it's kind of what you expect. And then the post-production process is easier. But I think for me, my experience is more often than not, there are always surprises. But those surprises often, if you're open to them, can elicit really, really great stuff. That's the fun part. You kind of make this, you think you're in control, then you go, no, I'm not in control. And you kind of rely on your instincts and your skill sets and your team to get what you can,
Yeah. All these people, both the kids and the adults, have survived a huge trauma collectively and, individually. And, they're still in the midst of trying to recover as they live within these, in these refugee camps. Talk to me in terms of being sort of sensitive to that, even though you may have gained access, to making the film, but being sensitive to the fact that people are still living through the immediacy of a great loss.
Yeah, I will say that having Zeynep, our producer in Turkey, who had covered the earthquake and is one of the most experienced producers and journalists I've worked with, kind of lead that was a real privilege, because I think when you make films and you're an outsider, you have to recognize that you're making film as an outsider, and you have to tread very lightly. And so we were invited by the NGOs into the second 2 locations, which were one was a earthquake camp, one was a community that had been very hard hit by the earthquake. Zeynep, because she speaks Turkey, sort of held court with all the parents, explained what we were up to. Is it okay if your kid is in this thing? If not, no problem. We'll film around them. And then I think critically, it was really important that we engage with what the kids are engaging in a way that is not re-triggering or re-traumatizing to them. And so we very much adhere to standards of reporting and trauma, which is basically, there's a lot to it, but I would say the clearest thing I can communicate here is to not ask specifically about the trauma. And if they bring it up, to not push and ask more questions about it. And so whenever, I don't know if anybody, they spoke about the earthquake, but in order to make different points. One talked about wanting to make new photos because he had lost his photos in the earthquake. So we didn't ever say, hey, what happened and how does it feel and where's your home? We would never engage in that way. The backdrop was obvious. What we wanted to do is just to see how they would engage with their world. And their world around them is one that is informed by this terrible earthquakes that have happened. And so the context kept bubbling up, but it was never anything that we asked about head on. I think that was really important, not only to the kids' obviously safety and sensitivity, but it was also not the point to make an earthquake film. It's to make a film about children in difficult situations, of which there are many around the world, and to show how resilient and sensitive these kids are, and how if you give them a camera or a paintbrush, they will find ways to find beauty in even some of the most difficult situations.
One of the more remarkable moments in the scene is when they are at the gravesite. They make photographs, and one of the people who was buried there, one of the girls knew, and she made a photograph of him. She made a print of the gravesite to give to the family, if I got that right. And I thought that was just sort of remarkable in terms of, one, the way that she talked about this person's death, who died not as a result of the earthquake, but because of some sort of altercation. But that she saw this photograph as a way of giving something that she created to someone else to help that other person in their grief. And I thought
she
that
talks
was
about sorry, go ahead.
No, I thought that was remarkable.
She speaks about how the widow of this man had gone to the grave every night to cry, to mourn, and it had been a very long time or months since he had passed. And she says, I feel if I maybe give her this picture, then she won't have to go all the way to the grave site. And it was this, I didn't know about it until I saw the translations, because with so much going on, sometimes these quieter moments get lost in the shuffle just when you're in the field. And I remember I teared up because it was this kind of expression of love. I mean, we see it with kids all the time, they get something and they immediately break it in half and give it to somebody else. And I thought that this they took so many pictures that day. And this is the one that she wanted. They get a print one, and this is the one that she wanted to print. And that also really resonated with me as well.
What was it from after filming? How long did it take to, finally got a final version of the film?
Maybe about 9 months. 9 months or so. We sort of jumped on other projects every now and then. We were all freelance filmmakers, but it was pretty steady for about 9 months. I think we did a rough draft to Sundance about 6 months in, which was the 40-odd minute version, which didn't make it. And then we went back to the chopping block. And that was, I'm used to working in news and even in news docs where there are really hard deadlines and editors that have, how do I say this, very clear ideas of what the film should and shouldn't be. And I think it was such a privilege to work with the folks that we present, because there were no time pressures. they had some notes that were great notes, but it wasn't like, here's the outline, here's what you need to lose in order to have it published. It was clearly, they were open to us finding our way there. And I think sometimes it just takes time. Every project kind of has a demand of its own and a metabolism of its own. And I've always really liked that, because you sort of dive into I'm starting a new film now, and you dive into the deep end. You go, I don't know how long this is going to take. I don't know what skills I'll have to develop, but it feels to me like a really worthwhile kind of way to live your life, like one project to the next. And that project will demand certain things of you. And it's a scary thing, because you kind of have to be up to it,
You said earlier that, working on this film sort of helped you to sort of recommit your life to doing this work. But how has working on this film sort of changed the way that you kind of see and approach it, especially having had the chance to, see the world through these kids' eyes?
Well, I think we all have, on our better days, this understanding, right? Like, if you're photographing, if you're teaching, there are those days when you can hold, as these kids do, the light and the dark quite well together. And so I think it was a reminder of that for me. And it's funny, because I've seen it a million times, but when it screens, or I'll show it to friends or family, it reminds me of those things again. I think good cinema does that. I think good art does that. It reminds you that life is complicated and messy, and that there's resilience all around you, and that it's a question of perspective often. So I would say, from that, answering your question from that space is kind of how I would say it. The other part of it is, I think that, if I'm being honest with you, I think that I had all these instincts of kind of what I wanted to do, and it felt like, well, this might work, but if it doesn't, we can just kind of cut. You can always come up with something. And it felt like the piece that I thought was really important was the piece that was important and really did happen. And that, to me, it was such a confidence boost. Like, oh, my instincts are correct. Like, oh, I can lean into these things that I am coming up with. I think often, as an independent artist, filmmaker, whatever, you can kind of question, you have this idea, and the next day you go, oh, fuck, is that any good? Am I crazy? So it's always nice to have an instinct about something, and it to sort of end up working well. And so now, when I'm moving through work, you asked how it impacted me. I do have a lot more sort of confidence of like, oh, this is a good story, and the documentary space is so competitive. You have to really kind of stick to your guns. Sometimes people work on these things for years, trying to raise money, trying to get access. And so it has to kind of come from a place of you really knowing that, like, this worth the struggle,
Have the families had an opportunity to see the film? And if so, what has their reaction been?
They have, yeah. I was not privy to that, because it was over WhatsApp, and Zenep had kept in touch with the families. They really loved him. They really were. I got some translated screenshots back that they said, they really kept they really had captured Ali, the little boy in the earthquake village, the last chapter, really, really well, because he has this sort of beautiful perspective in a very difficult situation. And so, yeah, that was really important to me, and important to our whole team, because we recognize that you're going and filming for a couple of weeks, but these are these children's lives. So it's important to get it right. I'm not somebody who's parachuting in and running away with the footage and doing what I want with it,
And you mentioned that Service has started another organization doing similar work. Can you update us with what's happening?
Yeah, it's called, I wrote down here. It's called Photohane, FOTOHANE.org. I haven't been to Turkey since he started this a couple months ago, but it's doing very similar work. And they're raising money and getting cameras and hopefully, as folks stumble across this film, stumble across, interviews like your own, more money and attention can go their way, because they're doing incredible work in a space that's very difficult to work in, and there's not a lot of programs like that.
Yeah. And how can people watch the film?
The film is online at We Present, and the whole film is on, they can watch the whole film online.
Well, it's a wonderful film, and I encourage everyone listening to check it out. It's really wonderful and heartening and inspiring in so many ways. So thank you for sharing that with me.
I appreciate the time and the curiosity and to really engage in this, because I think that it's so nice to speak with somebody that it seems like you got what I was trying to say. I can tell by your questions, so I appreciate that.
Well, my last question is I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer, or in this case, it could be a filmmaker, that our listeners can discover and explore on their own. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. And who would that one person be and why?
Oh, God, let me see. Okay, the film is Rich Hill, which is one of the films that when I was talking about kind of the films that moved me in this way, really blew me away. And I won't spoil anything, but stick with it. And it's a film that cracked me open completely. And the directors are Tracy Dros-Tragos and Andrew Dros-Palermo. It was, I think, 2012, 2013. It's a feature documentary. And is one of the most intimate, heartbreaking things you've ever seen. And I think that seeing films like that are the kinds of projects where I'm like, oh man, I want to keep hammering away at this craft to maybe make something of that caliber.
And the title again is what?
Rich Hill.
Rich Hill.
Rich Hill. Yep. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to catching that. Well, Ilie, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks to Ilie for sharing his story and for making work that honors the voices and imaginations of children so often left out of the conversation. You can learn more about First Frames and Ilie's other projects by visiting his website and following him on social media. Links will be available in the show notes and the website. And if you're a fan of our work, please leave a review on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts, and share your favorite episode on social media, be it X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Use the hashtag #TheCandidFrame. You can also support The Candid Frame financially through my family's GoFundMe page and via Patreon. You'll find links for both in the show notes and the website. For one-time contributions, you can donate at BuyMeACoffee/TheCandidFrame. And I want to thank the many people who have supported us recently, including Tadashi, Ethan Hinton, John Agather, Elaine Leggett, and Bruce Harmon. You've made a big difference over the last several months. Thank you. We've also relaunched our newsletter on Substack. Subscribe today for regular updates, behind-the-scenes content, and access to a thriving photographic community. And if you ever can't find a specific episode on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts on, remember you can always download the Candid Frame app for iOS or Android. And thanks to your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. Our audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarionex, and this is The Candid Frame.